Hare Krishna. Am I audible?
Hare Krishna Prabhu, yes, Prabhu.
Okay. So we'll start with the Mangalacharan. Om Ajnana Timranjasya Jnana Jana Shalakaya Chakshurunitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namah Sri Chaitanya Mano Vistam Stapitam Yena Bhutali Swayam Upagadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Sri Guru Sri Udapadakamalam Sri Guru Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Raghunathan Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parjana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Sri Vishaka Nitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpati Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste तप्त कांचन गौरांगी राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्येव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय my screen is visible, right? Vedabase.
Yes, Prabhu, visible.
Okay. So today we'll continue with the sixth verse from chapter 10 of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1. So we'll try to recite the verse. Nadiyo vyadhyah klesha daiva bhutatma hetavaha ajata shatra abhavan jantunam radnikarichit. Nadayo vyadaya klesha daiva bhutatma hetavaha ajata shatra abhavan jantunam radnikarichit. Nadayo vyadaya klesha daiva bhutatma hetavaha ajata shatra abhavan jantunam radnikarichit. So anyone want to try?
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Nadayo vyadaya klesha daiva bhutatma hetavaha ajata shastra abhavan jantu nang rajnikarhichi.
Okay, good Mataji, thank you. Next. Hare Krishna. Okay, so we'll proceed. Nadiyo vyadya klesha daiva bhutatma hetavha ajata shatra bhavan jantunam rajnikarhichi. Na, never. Adaya, anxieties. Vyadya, diseases. Klesha, trouble due to excessive heat and cold. Daiva bhutatma, all due to the body, supernatural power, and other living beings. Hetava, due to the cause of Ajata Shatrau, unto one who has no enemy. Abhavan, happened. Jantunam, of the living beings. Rajni, unto the king. Karichit, at any time. Because of the king having no enemy, the living beings were not at any time disturbed by mental agonies, diseases, or excessive heat or cold. So in this chapter, as we saw from the first verse in the previous weeks, it talks about Lord Krishna's departure to Dwaraka after the war. So in the second verse, we saw that the first verse is about the question by Shaunaka Rishi to Sutta Goswami. He inquires about what happened after the war, how did Maharaj Yudhishthira get installed as the king, and how was he able to rule the kingdom of Hastinapur after the war. So to which Sutta Goswami starts to reply to Shaunaka Rishi from the second verse. And in the second verse, we saw that Sudha Goswami explains that Lord Krishna himself was very satisfied after installing Maharaj Yudhishthira as the king because he was a very righteous person and he was always ruling as a representative of the Supreme Lord. So he was completely devoid of all demoniac characteristics and full of virtues. So there's also a title given to Yudhishthira. I mean, he was also known as Ajata Shatru because he had no enemies. So that was another distinct characteristic of Maharaj Yudhishthira. So it is explained in this verse. We also saw in the previous verses about the many descriptions regarding how people were living during Maharaj Yudhishthira's reign of the kingdom of Hastinapura, how the largely agrarian society, even those who were engaging in agriculture, they were very prosperous, and even the natural resources and the weather conditions, they were all completely ideal for the people to engage in agriculture, and they were all living very prosperously. And it continued even during Maharaj Parikshit's reign. So everything, the entire kingdom of Hastinapur was, it remained a very glorious kingdom, even until the reign of Maharaj Parikshit, when he even expanded the kingdom further. But everything started to turn like upside down after Maharaj Parikshit's reign with the advent of Kali Yuga. So whatever is happening now in Kali Yuga is the exact opposite of what people were experiencing in the previous yugas, like Dwapara, Treta, and Satyuga. So in this verse, it's stated that because of the kings having no enemy, the living beings were not at any time disturbed by mental agonies, diseases, or excessive heat or cold. The purpose to be non-violent to human beings and to be a killer or enemy of the poor animals is Satan's philosophy. So if we look at the Bhagavad Gita also, it is, we even saw in our Friday session that the Bhagavad Gita consists of 5 core concepts, or the 5 main subject matters. That is Ishvara, Jiva, Prakriti, Kala, Karma. So apart from Ishvara, it also talks about the Jivas and living, meaning living entities. And the true meaning of Jiva, it refers to all living entities because it deals with the notion of spirit soul. So in the Gita, though it appears like Lord Krishna is actually giving instructions to Arjuna, the teachings of the Gita apply to all living entities because all the living entities are basically spirit souls. So the knowledge of the Gita is meant to elevate all the conditioned souls, regardless of their current condition, in whether they are encaged in the human form, in the human body, or other forms of material body. So in the Gita itself, in many verses, Krishna uses the word Bhutanam. He is actually giving instructions to Arjuna, but the teachings are meant for all living entities. So it is the word Bhutanam and the words like Jiva are used to denote that the knowledge is applicable to all living entities. For example, in Gita 5.18, the verse goes like this: Vidya Vinaya Sampanne Brahmane Gavihasni Suni Chaiva Svapakecha Pandita Samadarshinaha. The humble sages, by virtue of true knowledge, see with equal vision a learned and gentle Brahmana, a cow and elephant, a dog and a dog eater. So in the purport of this verse from Bhagavatam, when Prabhupada says to be non-violent to human beings and to be a killer or enemy of the poor animals is Satan's philosophy. So this is also conveyed by the knowledge in Gita, because in Gita 5.18, Krishna says that the humble sages, by virtue of true knowledge, see with equal vision a learned and gentle Brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a dog eater, meaning all are living entities. So that's what Krishna is emphasizing. And those who are truly in knowledge should be able to see with equal vision, because it is the same Paramatma that resides in all the different material bodies. But the living entities are all the same spirit souls. So even in the purport for Gita 5.18, just some important points. A Krishna conscious person does not make any distinction between species or caste. So in this, in the verse 5.18 from Gita, it is mentioned that the truly learned person will be able to see with equal vision. He will be able to see a gentle Brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a dog eater with equal vision. So in the first line of the purport, Prabhupada mentions that a Krishna conscious person does not make any distinction between species or caste. So we can see that many so-called fighters of human rights and all that, they talk about treating people equally, but nobody cares about the kind of treatment that we give to animals, because animals are also living entities. The same spirit soul, I mean, even for animals, they are also spirit souls that are encaged in different material bodies. So that's why in the verse from Gita, it is stated that a person who is truly in knowledge will be able to see with equal vision. So that's why a Krishna conscious person does not make any distinction between species or caste. So Prabhupada is even making it clearer that we should not, it doesn't suffice if we simply say that let's treat all people equally. It is also important that we treat all living entities equally. So that's why the knowledge of the Gita and the entire message of Sanatana Dharma is applicable to all living entities. It is a universal message, so it is not sectarian. As far as the bodies are concerned, in different castes or different species of life, I mean, this is the continuation of the purport for Gita 5.18. As far as the bodies are concerned, in different castes or different species of life, the Lord is equally kind to everyone, because he treats every living being as a friend, yet maintains himself as Paramatma, regardless of the circumstances of the living entities. The Lord as Paramatma is present in both in the outcast and in the Brahmana, although the body of a Brahmana and that of an outcast are not the same. Similarly, our material body, we as human beings, our material body is not the same as that of the animals. However, we are all spirit souls. We all have the same qualitative similarity with the Supreme Lord. And the Supreme Lord himself, he does not discriminate between us and animals or any other living entities, because the Paramatma is always present in all the different material bodies, meaning he is accompanying the living entity, the spirit soul that is present in all the different 84 lakh material bodies. So that's why the teachings imparted by Lord Krishna in the Gita are actually meant for all living entities, not just for human beings. Though it appears like he is giving instructions to Arjuna, the teachings are meant for all living entities, because the Supreme Lord sees us equally. He views all the living entities equally as his parts and parcels. Also in Gita 5.29, in the verse, it said, Krishna says, Bhoktaram Yaktam Tapsam Sarvaloka Maheshwaram Surdam Sarva Bhutanam Nyatva Mam Shantim Richati. In this verse, in Gita 5.29, the third line, Surdam Sarva Bhutanam, means that the Supreme Lord is the well-wisher of all living entities. So again, he is using the word Bhutanam, Sarva Bhutanam, meaning all living entities. Then again, in 13.28, in chapter 13, verse 28 of the Gita, Krishna says, Samam Sarveshu Bhuteshu Tishtantam Parameshwaram. Also, this verse also talks about how the Paramatma resides in the heart of all living entities. Again, the word used here is Samam Sarveshu Bhuteshu, meaning all living entities. Then also in 15.7, chapter 15, verse 7 of the Gita, Krishna says, Mamayanso Jiva Loki Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Again, the word Jiva Bhuta, meaning all living entities. And then even in the last chapter, in chapter 18, verse 61, again Krishna says, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam Hrideshe Junittishtati. Krishna says that the Paramatma feature resides in the heart of all living entities. So that's why even from the Gita, we can see that Krishna is repeating this so many times. So that itself shows how significant is this concept of respecting all living entities. The so-called advocates of equal rights, advocates of human rights, they talk about human rights, equal rights for all human beings, but they simply don't care about how we treat animals. So that's why in the first line of this purport, Prabhupada says, to be non-violent to human beings and to be a killer or enemy of the poor animals is Satan's philosophy. Then the continuation of the purport, in this age, there is enmity toward poor animals, and therefore the poor creatures are always anxious. The reaction of the poor animals is being forced on human society, and therefore there's always the strain of cold or hot war between man individually, collectively, or nationally. Even in last week's session on Bhagavatam for the previous verse, we saw that in this age of Kali, in this degraded age, there's always this conflict between man and animal, and also between man and other entities. So it is particularly happening in this age of in this degraded age of Kali, and we can also see that nowadays we have seen from the previous verses in this chapter that the society was largely engaged in agricultural activities, and still they were very prosperous. Especially there are descriptions about how people were in a very cheerful mood when they were going to Nandotsav after the birth of Krishna. The Vaishya community, who were under the rule of Nanda Maharaj, they were all carrying so many presents, dressed in so many jewels, though they were all part of the Vaishya community engaged in farming and cow protection. Today, whenever we talk about farmers, we can only see the image of some poverty-stricken person. That is the current state of agriculture today in almost all the countries. But it was the exact opposite in Dwapara Yuga and also in the previous Yugas, because though the people were engaged in agriculture, they were very prosperous, and everything, all the resources were always available in abundance. Compared to nowadays, we were told that we are going to achieve the status of a developed nation by a certain deadline, and we also saw what happened post that particular deadline. And then nowadays we are being told by the same people that we should grow our own vegetables to cope with increasing food prices. So that's how degraded things are in this age. And what's even worse is that we are trying to masquerade all our failures in the name of development. Almost all in this verse and also in all the previous verses, it has been described about how all the natural resources were so rich, and everything was so ideal for the population that was living under the rule of Maharaj Yudhishthira. But nowadays, the exact opposite is happening, and that is also because of us. Like in this verse also, when Prabhupada says that we are only being kind to human beings, but our treatment towards animals is completely different, because not just it's not just restricted to the slaughter of animals, merely to for our so-called dietary purpose. A lot of so-called scientists are saying that it is okay to eat meat as a source of protein. But apart from slaughtering animals for this dietary and nutritional purpose, we are also conducting so-called development works through massive deforestation. So by doing this deforestation, we are actually destroying all the natural habitats of the animals. So apart from killing those animals, we are also destroying their natural habitats to the point where we are causing them to be displaced from their natural habitats. And this is it's even a bigger sin to actually displace those animals like this, because we can even see that from the context of what happens to human beings who get displaced. So for example, this is an article by Ryan Perkins regarding the partition of India in 1947. So it is stated in this article that during the time of partition, just recently, I think last year or the year before that, the government of India declared August 14 as the day for remembering partition horrors. So what happened during that time was that up to 2 million people lost their lives, estimated 2 million deaths occurred, but about 14 million people were displaced. So if we see in this case, for those 2 million people who died, they were actually relieved from their suffering, because the moment we leave our body, then we don't really have to be part of this Dukalayam, as Krishna says in the Gita 8.15. But for those people who were displaced, the 14 million refugees, it was much worse for them. So it is described here in this article. Up to 2 million people lost their lives in the most horrific of manners. The darkened landscape bore silent witness to trains laden with the dead, decapitated bodies, limbs strewn along the sides of roads, and wanton rape and pillaging. There was nothing that could have prepared the approximately 14 million refugees for this nightmare. So there were people who were made homeless in both sides of the border. So if we compare with those 2 million people who died, for them, it was probably much easier because they had already left their body and there was no more suffering after that. But for those who were living homeless, those who were rendered homeless, so it was much worse for them. The partition into independent nations was accompanied by one of the largest mass migrations in human history and violence on a scale that had seldom been seen before, as the provinces of Punjab and Bengal were effectively split in half. Approximately 7 million Hindus and Sikhs and 7 million Muslims found themselves in the wrong country. Believing they would return home, many families left their valuables behind before they packed up their essential belongings and began the trek to India or West or East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. Many never made it. So during that time, when people were made homeless, they were displaced, so they had to leave behind their belongings, whatever they have earned, so much of hard-earned money and all that they had to leave behind. And this was happening on both sides of the borders. So this is what happens when people become displaced. And this was in 1947, but there are also more recent examples, like the exodus in Kashmir in 1990. It is said that that's actually the 7th exodus, because there have been many others before during different periods of time over the past 600 to 700 years. So even in those cases, there were many people who died, and there were also people who were displaced. They were rendered homeless. So this is what happens to us as human beings when we become displaced, when we are rendered homeless. So even we have to suffer so much, and we don't even we don't have to simply focus on these extreme issues. We can also look much closer to home. Even in Malaysia, we can see that whenever there are some floods, people will have to leave their homes and go to other shelters, though it is just for a temporary period of time. People have to undergo so many hardships. So we as human beings, with our with so much of intelligent capacity compared to animals, we ourselves are suffering so much, even when we have to leave our homes for a temporary period of time. Ironically, in the case of floods, we tend to term them as natural disasters, but the irony is that we are the ones who cause this entire mess, and then we call it natural disaster. So even in such cases, when people are forced to leave their homes to other shelters, even for a temporary period of time, whenever there's a flood or something, people are facing so many hardships. So just imagine how difficult it would be for the animals to lose their natural homes forever, because after deforestation, we engage in so much deforestation at times in the name of development. Then we also put up so many hoardings saying that we are going to plant millions of trees in the coming n number of years. So first we cut down all the existing trees, and then we put up new hoardings saying that we are going to plant millions of trees. So this is what development in this age of Kali is all about. And I also found this interesting article regarding deforestation. So all these, all the points mentioned in these information regarding deforestation, climate change, global warming, all these are merely results of us. It is all because of our obsession with so-called development, material development, in terms of transgressing what has been instructed in our scriptures. Like, for example, last week's session, we also saw regarding this Ishavasya principle in Ishopanishad. After the invocation mantra, the first mantra talks about the Ishavasya principle, where we all can live peacefully if we only utilize our quota. So whenever we transgress what has actually been meant for us, and we become greedy, and we engage in efforts like deforestation and all that, so we can see that all these mess like global warming, climate change, all these were not created by nature, but we are the ones who created all this mess in the name of so-called development. And regarding deforestation, it's not that we are only cutting down trees and destroying the natural habitats of animals. What happens is that it has been mentioned in Vishnu Purana regarding the 84 lakh species. Jalaja Navalakshani, Stavaram Laksha Vimsati, Krimio Rudra Sankhya, Pakshinam Dasalakshanam, Trimshal Lakshani Pasava, Chatur Lakshani Manusha. Jalaja Navalakshani means 9 lakh aquatics, the aquatic kind of material bodies. Stavaram Laksha Vimsati, 20 lakh plants and non-moving entities. Krimio Rudra Sankhya, 11 lakh germs and insects. Pakshinam Dasalakshanam, 10 lakh species of birds. Trimshal Lakshani Pasava, the quadrupeds or 4-legged animals, 30 lakh species. Chatur Lakshani Manusha, 4 lakh human species. So total we have this 84 lakh species. And in the second line, it is stated Stavaram Laksha Vimshati. There are 20 lakh trees and non-moving living entities. So even when we cut down trees, we are also destroying the living entities, because even trees are regarded as living entities, meaning they are also part of this 84 lakh species. That's why in many of Prabhupada's lectures, he has maintained that Krishna consciousness is not merely about vegetarianism, it is about prasadatarianism, because whether we kill a cow or a vegetable, the sinful reaction is always there. So that's why in Gita also, we can see that in chapter 3, from 3.9 until 3.14, it talks about the significance of yajna to perform sacrifices and also to offer all the resources as offerings to the demigods. Of course, the offerings are ultimately made to please Vishnu, the Lord of sacrifices. And apart from that, even in Gita 9.26 and 27, Krishna himself says in 9.26, Krishna says, Patram Pushpam Phalam Toyam, Yome Bhaktya Prayasati, Taram Bhakti Upatam, Ashnami Prayatatmanaha. And then in 9.27, Krishna talks about whatever you eat, whatever you do, whatever austerities you perform, you do everything as an offering to me. So all these verses are meant to nullify the sinful reactions. Though we, Prabhupada himself says that the sinful reaction is always there, whether we kill a cow or a vegetable, but we have to offer to Krishna our offerings so that the sinful reactions are nullified, and we only take the remnants as prasadam. So that's how we can actually go beyond the mode of goodness towards Suddha Sattva or pure goodness. So even destroying trees due to deforestation, that is also a sin when we consider that from this perspective, because it is stated that stavarams are also part of these 84 lakh material bodies. And apart from that, in Gita 10.25, this is the chapter on opulence of the absolute, Vibhuti Yoga. So in 10.25, Krishna says, Maharshinam Riguram Giram Asmi Ekam Aksharam, Yajnanam Japa Yajnosmi, Stavaranam Himalaya. Of the great sages, I am Bhrigu. Of vibrations, I am the transcendental Om. Of sacrifices, I am the chanting of the holy names, Japa. And of immovable things, I am the Himalayas. So it is explained in the purport. Whatever is sublime in the worlds is a representation of Krishna. Therefore, the Himalayas, the greatest mountains in the world, also represent him. The mountain named Meru was mentioned in a previous verse, but Meru is sometimes movable, whereas the Himalayas are never movable. Thus, the Himalayas are greater than Meru. So it is stated in this shloka, Stavaranam Himalaya. So Stavarams also refer to plants, trees, and all non-movable entities. So they are also part of the 84 lakh species. So when we talk about deforestation, we not only cut down trees, we also destroy mountains and hills, all in the name of development. And then we complain about the weather, climate change, and all that. We are the ones, we create the mess, and then we complain about everything. So this is the degraded condition of this age of Kali. Whatever we are seeing now is the exact opposite of how it was in Dwapara Yuga, especially during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira. Then it is also stated in the purport, at the time of Maharaj Yudhishthira, there were no different nations. Although there were different subordinate states, the whole world was united, and the supreme head, being a trained king like Yudhishthira, kept all the inhabitants free from anxiety, diseases, and excessive heat and cold. They were not only economically well-to-do, but also physically fit and undisturbed by supernatural power, by enmity from other living beings, and by disturbance of bodily and mental agonies. So it is stated here that a trained king like Yudhishthira, he was able to rule the entire world as one nation. It is also stated in the first canto of Bhagavatam in the later chapters regarding Maharaj Parikshit about how he further expanded the kingdom of Hastinapur to rule over the entire Jambudvipa. Of course, we have seen many details regarding Jambudvipa and other Dvipas in our Friday sessions related to Madhya Loka. So what we are actually living in Bharatavarsha, and that too in Bharatakanda. Bharatavarsha itself is just one of the 9 Varshas in the entire Jambudvip. So Bharatavarsha is the southernmost tip of Jambudvip, and within Bharatavarsha also there are further divisions, out of which we are actually situated in Bharatakanda. So even in Bharatakanda, that is the subset of the subset, even in this tiny portion of the Bhumandal, there are so many different nations. But during the reign of Maharaj Parikshit, he was able to rule over the entire Jambudvipa. So that also shows how degraded things are now in Kali Yuga, because during the previous Yugas, the previous kings like Yudhishthira and Parikshit, they were able to rule the entire Jambudvipa because they had the ability. But nowadays, due to the degraded condition in Kali, where even we as human beings, we are so degraded, so we are not, we'll never be able to rule like them. Though there are many rulers of the so-called developed nations, they are trying to rule over the whole world, but that only results in conflicts. And this is exactly opposite to what was happening in Dwapara Yuga, because the entire world was united as one nation under a righteous king like Maharaj Yudhishthira. And then it even got expanded further. The kingdom of Hastinapur was expanded further by Parikshit. So they were such righteous kings in those days because they always regarded themselves as mere representatives of the Supreme Lord. They never tried to transgress the authority of the Supreme Lord, unlike the demoniac and atheistic rulers in this age of Kali. So that's why in those days, the whole world was united and everything was happening without any conflicts. It was all united under one kingdom, under the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira, without much conflicts. But the exact opposite is happening nowadays. There is a proverb in Bengali that a bad king spoils the kingdom and a bad housewife spoils the family. This truth is applicable here also. Interestingly, Prabhupada mentions that this proverb is in Bengali, that a bad king spoils the kingdom and a bad housewife spoils the family. But interestingly, in Malaysia, we have seen how a bad wife is not just bad for the husband, but also for the entire nation. I guess it's quite obvious because there was this very bad wife who actually spoiled the career of her husband, who was one of the previous administrative head of this country. In fact, there was even a meme in which it was stated that a good wife can transform a prisoner into a prime minister, but a bad wife can transform a prime minister into a prisoner. So, though Prabhupada mentions that this proverb is a Bengali proverb, but interestingly, we can see how true it is even in the context of Malaysia. Because the king was pious and obedient to the Lord and sages, because he was no one's enemy, and because he was a recognized agent of the Lord, and therefore protected by him, all the citizens under the king's protection were, so to speak, directly protected by the Lord and his authorized agents. So even in the previous verses, especially in verse number 2 of this chapter, it was stated that Lord Krishna himself was very satisfied after installing Maharaj Yudhishthira as the king, because Maharaj Yudhishthira was always ruling the kingdom as a representative of the Lord, unlike the demoniac kings, especially the Kauravas, or even other examples from the previous yugas, like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, who wanted to replace the Supreme Lord. So, such demoniac personalities were easily handled by the Supreme Lord. But in the case of righteous kings like Yudhishthira, they were especially favored by the Supreme Lord. And therefore, the entire population and also even the natural resources were completely ideal and in harmony during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira and Parikshit. Unless one is pious and recognized by the Lord, he cannot make others happy who are under his care. There is full cooperation between man and God and man and nature, and this conscious cooperation between man and God and man and nature, as exemplified by King Yudhishthira, can bring out happiness, peace, and prosperity in the world. The attitude of exploiting one another, the custom of the day, will only bring misery. So, despite the fact that we are still in the early phase of Kali Yuga, we are already seeing that many of the symptoms of full-blown Kali Yuga are already showing now itself, due to the completely demoniac characteristics of Kali Divas. So all these, whatever we are seeing nowadays, are the exact opposite of how things were in the previous yugas. So that's all for this verse. Actually, from verse number 7 to 10, those are quite short verses with quite simple purpose. So I think we can complete those verses also today from 7 to 10. So let's take a break for 5 minutes. Then we'll continue with verse number 7. Okay. Hare Krishna. Can we continue?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay, so my screen is visual, right? Verse number 7.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So verse number 7. Ushitva Hastinapure Masan Katipayan Hari Surdam cha Vishokaya Swashuscha Priya Kamyaya. Sri Hari, Lord Sri Krishna, resided at Hastinapura for a few months to pacify his relatives and please his own sister Subhadra. Krishna was to start for Dwaraka, his own kingdom, after the battle of Kurukshetra and Yudhishthira's being enthroned. But to oblige the request of Maharaj Yudhishthira and to show special mercy to Bhishmadev, Lord Krishna stopped at Hastinapura, the capital of the Pandavas. The Lord decided to stay, especially to pacify the aggrieved king, as well as to please Subhadra, sister of Lord Sri Krishna. Subhadra was especially to be pacified because she lost her only son, Abhimanyu, who was just married. The boy left his wife, Uttara, mother of Maharaj Parikshit. The Lord is always pleased to satisfy his devotees in any capacity. Only his devotees can play the parts of his relatives. The Lord is absolute. So now regarding Abhimanyu, we know that Abhimanyu is the son of Arjuna, but he was born to Arjuna and Subhadra. And in the Kurukshetra war, Abhimanyu was killed when Uttara was actually pregnant. So Abhimanyu got killed. But the most beautiful characteristic of Abhimanyu is that he was righteous enough to do his duty of fighting in such a condition when they actually knew that there was this possibility of him being killed. So if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, it was spoken to Arjuna. Lord Krishna gave instructions to Arjuna. But if we observe the life of Abhimanyu, he actually demonstrated how we can apply the teachings of Gita about how important it is to do our duty, regardless of the outcome. So when we engage in such nice nishkama karma, especially in the case of Abhimanyu, that is a perfect example of how one can actually do one's duty without being attached to the fruits of the actions. And in such cases, the Supreme Lord especially favors such persons. Like in the case of Abhimanyu, he got killed, but the Supreme Lord took special care to protect Uttara and Parikshit. And we actually know that how Parikshit was saved by the Supreme Lord. So Abhimanyu was willing to do his duty of fighting, and he made the supreme sacrifice. And he was favored by the Supreme Lord because the Supreme Lord gave special protection to Uttara and Parikshit, especially when they were about to be attacked by the Brahmastra released by Ashwatthama. So Abhimanyu was born to Arjuna and Subhadra. So just like Draupadi, who lost all her sons, even Subhadra was grieving, and therefore the Supreme Lord stayed a little longer in Hastinapura to console everyone. Now in the next verse, verse number 8. Afterwards, when the Lord asked permission to depart and the king gave it, the Lord offered his respects to Maharaj Yudhishthira by bowing down at his feet, and the king embraced him. After this, the Lord, being embraced by others and receiving their obeisances, got into his chariot. Maharaj Yudhishthira was the elder cousin of Lord Krishna, and therefore while departing from him, the Lord bowed down at the king's feet. The king embraced him as a younger brother, although the king knew perfectly well that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So in this case, Lord Krishna, when he was present as Swayam Bhagavan, regardless of the fact that he was Swayam Bhagavan, he came in his Swayam Rupa, but he was always demonstrating about how important it is for everyone to conduct their duties. For example, in this case, it is stated that Maharaj Yudhishthira was the elder cousin of Lord Krishna. Though Lord Krishna was Swayam Bhagavan himself, he was still showing the example of how one should respect the elders. And also in the 10th canto, there are descriptions about the daily activities of Lord Krishna, about how he was religiously following his routine, how he was doing his daily duties, despite the fact that he was Swayam Bhagavan himself. Because in the Gita, chapter 3, Lord Krishna himself says in 3.21, Yajyat acharati shreshas tatta tevetaro jana sayat pramanam kurte lokas tattanuvartate. Just as how a famous person behaves, others are likely to follow his example. So that verse in Gita 3.21, it's about leadership by example. And therefore, Lord Krishna also says in the following verses, after 3.21, he also explains that though I'm not bound by any actions in these three worlds, I still have to show the example of how important it is to others to do our duties. So he also explains regarding that. So though he descended to the material world as Swayam Bhagavan, he was always conscious about doing his duties in the material world, regardless of the fact that none of the material duties can bind him. He was still willing to show a good example of how other people should also perform their duties. The Lord takes pleasure when some of his devotees accept him as less important in terms of love. No one is greater than or equal to the Lord, but he takes pleasure in being treated as younger than his devotees. These are all transcendental pastimes of the Lord. The impersonalists cannot enter into the supernatural roles played by the devotee of the Lord. Thereafter, Bhima and Arjuna embraced the Lord because they were of the same age, but Nakula and Sahadeva bowed down before the Lord because they were younger than he. So it is stated here that the impersonalists cannot enter into the supernatural roles played by the devotee of the Lord simply because they don't even try to. They are simply satisfied with the partial realization of the impersonal Brahman or the Brahmajyoti realization. So the impersonalists, they themselves don't make the effort to appreciate the full Bhagavan realization, and therefore they can never get the opportunity to gain the full association of the Lord, because they themselves are limiting the extent of their association through their partial of the Brahman realization. So that's another reason why the full Bhagavan realization is more important. Verses 9 and 10. At that time, Subhadra, Draupadi, Kunti, Uttara, Gandhari, Dhritarashtra, Yudsu, Kripacharya, Nakula, Sahadeva, Bhimsen, Daumya, and Satyavati are all nearly fainted because it was impossible for them to bear separation from Lord Krishna. Lord Sri Krishna is so attractive for the living beings, especially for the devotees, that it is impossible for them to tolerate separation. Of course, the meaning of Krishna himself is all attractive. Just like Rama means the reservoir of pleasure, Krishna means all attractive. The conditioned soul, under the spell of illusory energy, forgets Lord. Otherwise, he cannot. There are also descriptions from Bhagavatam, especially in the third canto, in the part where this topic of pregnancy and embryology is discussed. It's described that the living entity, while being in the mother's womb, up to the last point before falling down to the material world, that living entity is praying to the Supreme Lord with God consciousness. But the moment the entity falls down to the material world with the material body, from that moment onwards, the living entity is pushed into forgetfulness of the Supreme Lord. So even while being in the womb of the mother, all living entities are still conscious of the Supreme Lord. But from the moment we enter this material world, from that moment onwards, we become completely forgetful of the Supreme Lord. The feeling of such separation cannot be described, but it can simply be imagined by devotees only. So from the moment we start forgetting the Supreme Lord until the moment we regain our consciousness, so we are completely oblivious to the kind of suffering that we are being put into in this material world. But from the moment we regain our God consciousness, especially Krishna consciousness, so from that moment onward, we will become more eager to regain the Supreme Lord's association in Goloka Vrindavan. So that eagerness to regain the Supreme Lord's association then makes us feel the sadness of being separated from the Supreme Lord. Since only when we regain our Krishna consciousness, only then we will start to feel the sadness of being separated from the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, we'll always be indulging in the so-called pleasures of this material world without even realizing that this place is Dukkalayam. After his separation from Vrindavan and the innocent rural cowherd boys, girls, ladies, and others, they all felt shocked throughout their lives. And the separation of Radharani, the most beloved cowherd girl, is beyond expression. So we know that Krishna left Vrindavan, and then they were like separated. The Rajvasis were completely separated from him, because after that he went to Mathura to release his parents, and then he became a Dwarkadish. So the Rajvasis were always in sadness, but that even made their devotion more intense, because they were thinking about him even more intensely. Once they met at Kurukshetra during a solar eclipse, and the feeling which was expressed by them is heartrending. There is, of course, a difference in the qualities of the transcendental devotees of the Lord, but none of them who have ever contacted the Lord by direct communion or otherwise can leave him for a moment. That is the attitude of the pure devotee. So unless we engage in Krishna consciousness seriously, as prescribed by our acharyas, we will never even feel this sadness of being separated from the Supreme Lord, and we can always indulge in the so-called pleasures of this material world, and we'll always be trapped in this never-ending cycle of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. So the only antidote for that is to practice Krishna consciousness and engage in devotional service, so that we can regain our eternal association with the Supreme Lord in Goloka Vrindavan. So we have completed up to verse 10. So that's all for today. Any questions or comments? Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu.
Okay, thank you, Mataji.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you, Prabhu.
Okay, thank you.